Tragedy is often defined as an event causing great suffering, destruction, or distress. This can come as a result of a serious accident, or in this instance, a terrible crime, and is often classified as a catastrophe. While the idea of having to endure such a tragic event could be considered more than enough to try the resolve and emotional state of many of us, what sort of courage and resilience must it take when every turn you take trying to make sense of this seemingly only uncovers more unexpected tragedy and heartache? When forced to relive these tragic events over and over, while appearing to have no support or closure to any of this, it can become very conceivable that your levels of understanding and patience soon fall victim to those of frustration, anger, and utter disdain. We piece together the next parts of this ever-evolving case and uncover the justifiable vitriol that one man has developed for the systems that are supposed to protect those in need, in this next episode of the Hillier triple murder, here on Just Lawful.
Adelaide is the perfect place to set a horror story. You know why all those films and books are always set in sleepy conservative towns? Because sleepy conservative towns are where those things happen. Exorcism, omens, shining, poltergeists. Adelaide is Amityville, or Salem, and things here go bump in the night.
Welcome once again to all of our listeners. My name is Daniel Panozzo, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Sean Fuster.
Thanks, Daniel. Welcome, listeners, to another episode.
Indeed, another episode, and if you haven't heard the previous episodes of this series, we do strongly recommend you go back to iTunes and Spotify and you listen to those episodes, because this has been a case that's filled with so many moving parts, it's really been difficult to follow all of them up to this point.
Yeah, the twists, the turns, the machinations, and believe it or not, it's only going to get more complicated from here.
It is. Before we get to there, we'd like to once again state that our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners are advised that the following program contains the names and references to people who have died. Also, if you do find anything we discussed distressing, please make use of the following support resources: the Victim Support Service on 8231 5626 or 1800 182 368, the Domestic Violence Crisis Service on 1300 782 200, Domestic Violence Gateway Service on 1800 800 098, and the National Sexual Assault, Domestic and Family Violence Counselling Service on 1800 RESPECT.
It's interesting that you say respect. It's interesting that you say support, and most especially that you say victim support. Because what we need to talk about in this episode is what happens when those things aren't in place. When a victim of crime and their family is disrespected. When a victim of crime and their family is left unsupported. And what happens to those people, to those families, when they're left floundering by what likes to call itself the justice system.
We do, Sean, and to do that, I'm going to step back in our last episode. We ended that last episode with something you said, an incredibly powerful statement that you just made. We worked out who this family was that had been coming to court, and you just made contact with this gentleman, Stephen, who had said to you he had no time left for any of the system, any of the prosecutors. A man that said this had cost him his family and his sanity.
That's right. We're talking about Stephen Egberts, the paternal grandfather of Amber and Corey, the 8 and 6-year-olds who were murdered at the Hillier farmhouse, along with their mother, Yvette Rigney. By this point in events, you'll remember that Stephen Pete, Yvette's former partner, had pleaded guilty to murdering Yvette, that he had denied murdering Amber and Corey, and he had raised the legal defense of automatonism, this idea that he had psychologically and mentally left his body, worked on remote pilot, and killed the 2 children while not psychologically culpable for his actions. That had sparked a 6-month adjournment in the case, while prosecution tried to figure out what they were doing next, because Daniel, as you'll remember, it's not for the defense to prove their client is an automaton, it's for the prosecution to disprove it.
Yeah, absolutely, Sean. more than that, though, and you are right in everything you've said, and you've really laid that out in a great format so that we know exactly where we're at right now. The other side to this, and this is kind of going to lead into where you're at, that threw everything into disarray. You had, a judge, defense, counsel, prosecution, yourself, the families had all come together for 2 weeks of a trial situation to talk about these 3 murders. Before morning tea on that very first day, we found out that suddenly we're now only looking at 2 murders because one of them's now essentially been solved as the guilt has been assigned. Now, though, rather than being able to do that, we have to take a short adjournment for a few days to come back to find out it's a 6-month adjournment. Not only that, though, the families involved aren't advised of that. In fact, you're only advised of that because it was a closed court hearing that you've had to make your own sort of lead and queries into to find that out. And then you've been the one that's had to then relay that information on to Steve and his wife, Janet.
And this is my first interaction with Steve and Janet. I had seen them at court throughout the process to this point, didn't know who they were, didn't realise that they were the paternal grandparents of Amber and Corey. Imagine that. Your first interaction with these people is, how do you feel about the 6-month adjournment in the case? And you get back a teary, broken-hearted, what 6-month adjournment? No one's told us anything. To set the scene for you, my first encounter with Steve and Janet was over the phone. At that point, the advertiser had an office in the courthouse. So I was in a little side room, court's going on around me, and I'm sitting in this sandstone-coloured room talking on my mobile phone to 2 people, giving them yet another dose of bad news.
Yeah.
What I got back from Steve honestly chilled me. Because remember, to this point, we knew that the family of Yvette, Corey, and Amber had been involved with Families SA, Child Protective Services. We knew that there were assertions that Yvette had been taking drugs, that the children weren't cared for.
Yep.
There was a spectre hanging over this case at this point that perhaps the system had let that family down. What I was about to learn was that the system had not only let them down before they died, but it had continued to let down their memory and their family. Not just the child protective system, but the very prosecutorial system that was supposed to be, as far as they felt, advocating for them and their lost loved ones.
So we're not just talking about the failure here of one system, we're potentially talking about the failure of multiple systems and fraternities within that. We know that there was a connection with Families SA, as you said, and that's going to elaborate what that looks like and what that was. Now we're also calling into question the prosecutorial situation as well.
Let me take you to what Steve said to me. These prosecutors aren't helping us at all. They're just there to ensure this bloke, meaning Pete, gets a fair trial. And the cost of that is the sacrifice of all of our sanity. I know we can never get back what we've lost, but the lack of respect, the lack of preparation, the lack of empathy is appalling and abhorrent.
That's strong words, Sean, and you got to remember, this is coming from a man who has got to be coming from an incredibly grief-stricken perspective, having gone through all of this, having potentially, as you said, not just the tragedy of those events of that day in that farmhouse in Hillier, everything after that, to then go to court, to then hear that Stephen Pete's now actually admitted guilt to one, but not to the children, to then have this come up. So there's clearly a lot that's happened in the back end here that perhaps you're not privy to yet.
And I'm learning this from Steve.
Yeah.
Do you remember what I said to you last episode? There's no ground floor in hell.
Yeah, sure.
There is always a deeper level that trauma and tragedy can go. We're descending.
Right.
What Steve told me was this. You'll remember the children died on a Monday. The Tuesday, the next day, we've already heard that Yvette was going to go see another man.
Correct, yeah.
The person with whom she was thinking about resuming a relationship, leaving Pete and moving on.
Sure.
The question in my mind had always been, well, where were the children going to go on Tuesday?
Sure.
Were they going to stay with Pete? Were they going to go to school? What was going to happen? Steve said, I was supposed to take custody of the children on Tuesday for a period of time. They were going to come and live with us for a period of time. because the Tuesday after they died was my 50th birthday. He was supposed to have those kids 24 hours later. So instantly you're thinking, the self-recrimination, undeserved and needless, but the self-recrimination you'd go through if it only had been 24 hours sooner.
Yeah.
Steve said, nobody expected this,
Of course.
a triple murder.
Yeah.
But we had grave concerns for the children's welfare. Families SA did not once investigate, despite 14 mandatory notifications over 18 months.
So hang on, just explain to me, when you say mandatory notifications, so 14 mandatory notifications, 14 of anything is a large number.
Mandatory notification is if you're a teacher, a police officer, a caregiver,
Right.
someone who has a legal duty of care, and you see abuse going on or you suspect abuse is going on, you must report it to what was then Families SA, what is now the Department of Child Protection.
So there's been 14 of these instances over the last 18 months.
That's right. And Steve said nobody went to look for them. So many people told them, and they just absolutely ignored Corey and Amber.
That's tough to hear, Sean.
Especially when Families SA had finally turned up and knocked on the door at the moment that Steve and Pete was killing the family.
Sean, I think it's pretty easy and understandable as to why Steve and Janet would be disillusioned and frustrated and upset and angry with Families SA. From the little bit you've said so far, and from what I've sort of pieced and I mentioned earlier, it sounds like there's a lot more that's perhaps gone on behind the scenes between them and the prosecuting at this stage. What don't we know yet, or what are we finding out here?
I love the fact that you've started with, what are we finding out here? Let me ask you this.
Yeah.
If you lost loved ones
Sure.
under the most horrific of circumstances, how would you like to find out every beat, every inch of those circumstances in a courtroom full of people having never been told before?
Oh, okay, sorry. I thought you were going to ask me how I'd like to hear about it, and I was trying to find the best possible scenario. I wasn't expecting the back end of your comment there, where, sorry, they found this out in the courtroom.
You remember I described to you everybody sitting in court for the day of the trial, being ready for a 2-week trial. Steve and Janet did not know how Amber and Corey died until those words fell out of the mouth of the prosecutors.
How is that possible?
I don't know. And do you know what's worse? They are not the first family to tell me that. Time and time again over the past 19 years, Daniel, I have had families tell me that was the first I knew how they died.
How do we have a system set up that's the first notification that the people most sensitive to this and connected to this are finding this information out?
It defies logic, it defies compassion, it defies empathy. Why you would not take grieving relatives into a room well before a trial, sit them down and say, this is really horrible, you need to know about it before the trial. But no, for reasons of its own that, spoiler alert folks, I don't have an answer to this question. For reasons of their own, the South Australian Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions prefers to allow victims of crime to find out how their loved ones died when a trial begins during the prosecution opening.
Short of heartless and cruel, you mentioned before lack of empathy. Sean, when you're having this conversation with Steve and he tells you that, what's his reaction to that?
Steve said to me, it was the most heartbreaking thing in the world to hear. Absolutely heartbreaking. We just lost a piece of ourselves at that moment. It's all biased opinion because I'm their grandfather, but those kids were just beautiful. Amber spent her life singing and dancing. She had a laugh that you could sell. Corey was autistic, which was the first I knew of that, and would just have had no idea why or how this happened to him. And he said, the story of Corey struggling out of his bonds haunts me. That kid earned his freedom, and it was taken away. Steve said to me, these prosecutors just aren't helping us. They're not interested in empathy. They're interested in protecting a fair trial. He said they were almost like on rails. That was their goal. You know, they're a train, fair trial train. He said to me, we'd put questions to them. Like everybody else, we expected Pete to plead some form of insanity at some point in this. Because, of course, it is insane to do that to a mother and children. Yeah. And they'd deny us the possibility of all of those outcomes. When we got frustrated, they'd tell us that we prosecutors need to ensure a fair trial. Janet and I understand that, but we don't want to hear it every single time we talk to them.
Sean, I want to just pick a point there if you can, you know, and I understand, you know, you said that the prosecutors are on rails and they have a single objective, and not to be cold and callous and cruel, I want to play both sides of this coin. They do have a role to play, and you're quite right, and Steve said it himself, they are there to ensure a fair and just trial is held and everyone in there gets their time and it's fairly adjudicated. And I get that, and by definition and by default, being empathetic to those who are victims and have had this done to them is technically not their role, and I totally get that. And I don't want to sound cold and callous as I say this, but for the love of anything just purely nice, is there not some level of humanity that just says, don't put these people through more than they've already had to endure?
A fair trial. True justice comes when the rights of all people are respected.
Yeah.
Steve and Janet's rights, the other families that I've spoken to that have been through this exact same trauma. And I mean it. It's a trauma.
Absolutely.
There's no fairness in that for them.
No.
None whatsoever, because these people they're not calling Steve and Janet to give evidence at the trial.
Right.
You don't have to seal them off from the potential, you know, biased evidence or something like that.
No.
They have no role to play in the legal function.
Yeah.
You can tell them what they need to know in order to get some form of closure, get some form of peace, just to be ready for that.
I was going to say, the preparedness, just a little bit of preparation, so that's not the first time you're smacked in the face with it in front of everyone else sitting in that courtroom. That's callous.
And for it to have happened before, like I said, this is not the first triple murder I've ever covered.
Yeah.
The other time, one of the other times that families have said to me that was the first we heard of it, was the other triple murder.
Yeah, okay. So
There's
this
a
is
pattern here.
I was going to say, it's not a one-off situation. Okay.
And look, Steve said that. He said, we don't feel there has ever been enough cooperation or empathy. And all of those outcomes we asked about have ended up coming true. I understand, he said, that this latest claim by Pete of automatism is complex, but the lack of preparation is appalling. I'm not sure the DPP knows exactly what it's going to do.
And I understand there are so many moving parts, to be said, and any trial of any description has so much information and circumstance around it. This is a man who has clearly no certainty in anything right now.
None whatsoever. He said, there's no certainty, there's just absolute shock. There's nothing fair about what happened to Amber and Corey, and it's so hard that the constant refrain we get whenever we speak up is, we have to ensure a fair trial. He said, where's the empathy?
Yeah.
They're not asking for solutions. They understand how complex things are.
Yeah.
All they want is some understanding. We know what you're going through. Here's what we can tell you.
Yeah.
No blindsiding.
No
stonewalling.
Yeah.
No keeping this family on rails. No, just sit in the back of the ute. We're driving. We've got this handled.
Yeah. Tough to hear, Sean. Tough to hear. I'm intrigued though. What else was there? Please, was there anything else? What else did we find out from Steve?
Yeah, there was. We found out from Steve that the state government offered to pay for Corey and Amber's funerals and then completely botched it. Your obvious question, how do you botch a funeral?
Sean, look, on the surface, that seems like a wonderful gesture. They've offered to pay for that, and that seems like I'll be honest, the first drop of anything almost humanitarian and empathetic in this whole situation. What a lovely gesture.
And Steve and Janet needed that at that time.
Of course.
As Steve said, he's never attended a funeral to that point in his
Yeah,
life.
right.
It was a really new thing for him and his entire family. We were told to sit back and everything would be taken care of. He said we were very, very appreciative of that. The government spent $40,000 on the two funerals and no headstones were purchased for the kids.
So how do you spend $40,000 at a funeral of any circumstance and not have headstones?
Steve didn't know. He had no explanation for me. He said it was absolutely agonizing to go out to the cemetery and have to look at blades of grass on the ground. Nothing but blades of grass.
Was Steve and Janet or anyone at that point involved in the funeral process of putting this together?
They were. They were consulted throughout. They were sending email after email, making phone call after phone call, and getting delay after delay after delay. The funeral's held. There are no headstones. Steve and Janet decide we need headstones.
Yeah,
for
absolutely.
this. You just can't do that.
No.
So, again, call and call, email and email.
Yeah.
12 months later, Amber and Corey finally have headstones.
So it's taken an entire 12 months for a State Department to realise, although that we've made the wonderful gesture, and genuinely is a very gracious gesture, to pay for these funerals for these small children who've gone through a horrific situation.
Through hell. Let's call it what it is.
Sure.
Through hell.
Absolutely. It's taken 12 months for bureaucracy or whatever it took to work the grinding of that circle to get back to actually supplying 2 headstones for these children.
And grinding is the point. The grinding system failed to answer 14 mandatory notifications in 18 months. The grinding system organised a funeral with no headstones. The grinding system told 2 grieving grandparents, it's fine, we've got this covered, and then dropped a figurative bomb on them on the very first day of the trial, while telling them all the way along, don't worry about him pleading insanity.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen. And then it did.
And it does.
How do you have any faith left whatsoever in the systems that, as you said at the top of this episode, are designed to protect and look after us, when all you've seen it do is fail you again and again and again?
So, Sean, with this initial sort of conversation, I was going to say meeting catch-up, but it's a phone conversation. Let's not forget that.
It's an interview.
I was going to say, and let's not forget that, I won't call it impersonal, but you're not sitting across being able to see someone's body language and converse with them in that sense and connect. This is purely a phone conversation. What was Steve's, like, if you could wrap that, what was Steve's takeaway? What was your takeaway from Steve? That where was he at mentally, emotionally, whatever that was?
I'd call it focused rage.
Yeah, okay.
As you heard, I just read you what he said to me.
Sure.
Articulate.
Yeah.
Focused.
Well, that was one thing.
He knows exactly what he's talking about. He's had so long to be angry.
Absolutely.
That anger has calcified almost into a sharp point.
Mm.
He knows exactly what he's talking about,
Yeah.
exactly what he's gone through, does not want to suffer anymore,
No.
and yet is resigned to the fact that in 6 months' time, he's going to have to go through it all over again, and who knows what's going to be the next twist.
Absolutely. And it's at 6 months. How was his thought process around the 6 month piece?
He couldn't believe it. He said, like I said to you, he warned the prosecution.
Yep.
This guy could plead insanity.
Yep.
They went, it's not going to happen. Here we are right now. Your worst nightmare meets your worst nightmare to create an all-new nightmare.
And by the way, you get to wait 6 months before we touch on that as well. Sean, it's one thing to have spoken to Steve and heard what he had to say. They are what we call at this stage, though, technically only allegations. They're his version of a story. So again, I don't want to sound cold and callous. With that, though, what do we do with this? As a journalist as yourself, what do you do now that you have these allegations?
Well, if you believe the detractors, I'd just print that and let it go happen. But that's not what we do.
Okay.
What you do is you take that information, you consider it, and you say, all right, who do I need to call to get response to this? Yeah. Who has Steve levelled allegations against?
Mm-hmm.
I need to give them right of reply.
And as you said, because we don't operate in the world of clickbait journalism, we don't do that. You do your due diligence. You go to that and you check that out.
That's right. So I had to make 3 phone calls.
Okay.
The first was to the Office for the Director of Public Prosecutions to put to them everything Steve said.
Sure.
You lack empathy. You mislead people.
Mm-hmm.
You don't give them the proper information. You stonewall them. You allow them to find out these horrible things on the very day of trial.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that?
Okay.
The answer is always, can you put it in an email? We will respond to your email.
Okay.
Okay, fine.
Sure.
Second call is to Families SA,
Mm-hmm.
now the Department for Child Services, Department of Child Protection. Allegation has been made that there were 14 mandatory notifications in 18 months. What do you say to that?
Yeah.
It's no longer about Families SA being on the doorstep the
Nope.
day of the murders. That's an uncontrovertible fact.
That's been spoken about in a court of law.
That's done.
We know that.
We know that now. We
Yep.
knew it back then. You wouldn't admit to it then. We know it now.
Know it.
So what do you say about these 14 mandatory notifications? The third call is a bit more nebulous.
Okay.
It's calling the state government, just in general,
Mm.
and saying someone somewhere botched this funeral,
Right.
according to the grieving family. How do you respond to the assertion that this funeral got stuffed up, that you managed to spend 40K to put 2 kids in the ground and not give them headstones somehow?
Yeah. Okay.
How did you possibly do that?
All right. So you've got 3 phone calls to make.
3 phone calls to make. DPP says, put it in an email, we'll get back to you.
Right.
Department for Child Protection says, put it in an email, we'll get it back to you.
Okay.
Government spokesperson I speak to says, I'll make some calls and find out who you need to speak to.
Okay.
Because they weren't sure.
Sure.
Maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours later, I get a phone call from a person that I'm not going to name, but a person who was senior within the then South Australian government.
Okay.
I answer the phone and they start with, why am I talking to you about this ungrateful family at 5 minutes to 5 on a Friday afternoon? I have things to do.
All right. Don't go any further. Don't say another word. I just want to almost go back and I'd love to hit the rewind button on that sentence. You said you're not going to put a name to that. Okay. Can you just give me some context of what this person has just said in the most, I'll say, remarkably callous and cruel way about a family who's already gone through this?
This person was upset that at the end of their working week, they were being bothered by a journalist asking them questions about a family that they considered to be ungrateful.
Huh. Just going to let that sit for a moment, because
I certainly did at the time.
Yeah, I'm ruminating on that. Well, there's a good question right there, Sean. What was your initial response to that?
The predator in me wanted to just start taking notes.
Yeah.
And say, cool, that's your comment, thank you very much, goodbye, and hang up.
Mm-hmm.
Measured my response, of course,
Okay.
and said, I'm sorry. Well, I'm busy with appointments, this person continued, and I have people waiting for me in my office right now, and I've been ordered by someone else to call you and sort this out. I don't see why it's my problem.
Okay.
So my response was, well, these are some serious allegations that have been made about the government. You're not the only person I'm speaking to this afternoon. I'm speaking to Families SA and I'm speaking to the Office of the Director of. I know who you're speaking to, and I'm supposed to sort all of that out as well. Why am I being bothered by this? This is ridiculous. I have more important things to do. We were getting stuck in a loop.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, I decided there was only one thing to do, and that was to give in to that predatory instinct. Excellent. Thank you very much for your comment. I'll be sure to quote you on that. Can I just check that your title is still blah, 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 blah? Wait, that's not my comment.
Well, it certainly sounded like a comment.
Took the words right out of my mouth. You've rung me. You've answered my question with this. I'm going to quote you on that. No, please don't. Please don't. Well, you haven't said we're off the record.
Yeah.
If you'd said we were off the record, I wouldn't be mentioning it right back to you, and I certainly wouldn't be mentioning it on this radio show right now.
Well, that's one thing right there. And again, that's another little one of these nuances that we will pull out as we go that I don't think necessarily a lot of people would understand. Speaking to yourself, Sean, as someone who is known as a journalist, you have the right to say, Sean, this is completely off the record.
Yep.
Thereby, it's that, for want of a better term, it's that parlay situation. I'm going to tell you something, but you're not able to actually use that against me in that sense or put that to my name.
Another way of saying it is on background. I'll
Correct.
give you the information on background.
Yeah.
The difference is on background means you can't attribute it to me. So, Daniel, I'm going to tell you on background that my shoes are red.
Right.
You can now report it's understood that on that day the person's shoes were red.
Sure.
But you can't say where you got it from.
Sure.
If I tell you off the record my shoes are red, you then know it for a fact and you need to go find it out from somewhere else where you can report it.
Yeah, there you go.
So anybody that speaks to me, be they a government minister, a member of the public,
Yep.
somebody that picks up the garbage, somebody that looks after all the money in the world.
Sure.
You start the conversation with this is on background or this is off the record, it never gets spoken about again.
There you go.
You don't get to pull back afterwards.
Exactly, yeah.
And suddenly declare something off the
Sorry,
record.
the horse certainly sounds like it's bolted at this stage.
This horse had bolted, had foals, and, started up a new lineage of thoroughbreds.
About 7 or 8 sort of counties across the land, yeah.
Absolutely. So this person's like, no, don't quote me
Sure.
on that. I'll give you a proper quote.
Yeah.
I'll sort out someone to come back to you and give you a proper quote. I'm just upset at the moment. I said, well, you're not as upset as these people are.
Yeah.
And to be quite frank, I understand why they're upset because if this is the kind of attitude that they have been encountering, if this is what Steve Egberts and Janet Wells have been dealing with since Corey and Amber died,
Yeah.
I completely understand why they're so angry. Oh, don't do anything. I'll get someone to get back to you.
That's exactly what I was thinking, Sean. If this is, evidentiary of the kind of, and you can't see it at home, the air quotes that I'm putting out at the moment, support and compassion or empathy that, Steve and Janet and anyone else in these circumstances received from these officers, no wonder they're feeling the way that Steve did.
Now take that sentiment and put it into your journalistic mind. You're developing a journalistic mind doing this show with me. I'm sure all of our listeners out there are starting to develop one as well. As a journalist, you want both sides. You want proof.
Absolutely.
You want to know that what you say and write is not going to embarrass you down the track or embarrass your newspaper, stain your credibility. If you have that kind of volcanic reaction to the assertions that Steve and Janet were making, how do you feel about Steve and Janet's veracity and reliability right now?
Look, I'm going to say the ball is absolutely in the court of them being more true, accurate, real than anything that might come from this spokesperson who shall not be named.
I said to you during the death of Jack Hanley case, there's no such thing as an unbiased journalist. There are only journalists who put their bias aside in order to do the job.
Sure.
I said to you that Julie Kelvin became a source of bias for me because I wanted to look after her.
Absolutely.
In that moment, having heard that governmental person give me that reaction, my bias quite obviously started leaning towards Steve and Janet because here were two people that are completely blameless, have done nothing wrong, have suffered far more than anybody should, and are getting treated like a word I can't say on commercial radio.
Absolutely.
So, as a result, I'm like, okay, I'm very certain that this story is going to run. Let's see who gets back to me now I've been promised a response.
Well, with that in mind, what happened next?
Well, I received a call from a man by the name of Michael O'Connell, who is the now former Commissioner for Victims' Rights, person whose job is to liaise between victims of crime in various agencies, not just the DPP, police, child services, all sorts of places, in order to make sure that things are done to help them out. And Mr. O'Connell said he'd sought to assist the family. He called them victims of tragic atrocities. He said they're entitled to compassion and dignity. And his quote was, "It would be inappropriate for me to try to dress up the timeliness of our responses. We have done all they asked, but clearly not as quickly as they wished." He said, "I kept them informed and I apologised whenever a delay happened." He said that the government had undertaken to explore, that's the word he used, explore Mr. Egbert's concerns, and said he would assist any inquiries himself. Mr. O'Connell said every child has a right to life. Should those tasked with protecting a child fail, they should be called to account. He said that his office, the Commissioner for Victims' Rights Office, actually paid for the funerals after being contacted by Families SA.
Okay.
He said the headstones exceeded the maximum $14,000 funeral benefit that state law allowed for, prompting what he called negotiations.
Okay.
And he said, during these months, other legal issues had to be addressed, and I am not at liberty to disclose what they are. Despite the time taken, I have throughout sought to do no more harm.
Okay. Look, it still doesn't give us all the answers. However,
it's a very compassionate response.
I was going to say that is the most compassion, empathy, understanding, care, consideration. Put any of those other words you want to that these people seemingly have had been exposed to throughout any of this.
But it's measured.
Yeah, it is.
It's measured with We'll explore what he
Correct.
has to say. We're sorry that it took longer than Steve wanted it to.
Sure.
There's no acknowledgement of responsibility or culpability. There's an acknowledgement of upset and harm having been caused, despite attempts to do otherwise.
Yep.
The DPP got back to me as well.
Okay.
Soon after, via email. Then, Director of Public Prosecutions Adam Kimber, SC, now District Court Judge, said through a spokesperson he'd investigate the complaint.
That's it. That's the response.
One sentence.
Okay. We've got one response left, I believe.
Yes. The Child Protection Department, formerly Families SA, by this point the changeover had happened.
Okay, so there'd been a change rebranded in the meantime.
Remember our sausage machine?
Absolutely.
Our mincing machine?
Yeah.
New badge on the machine now.
Okay, so we've got a different brand of sausage coming.
That's right. And a Child Protection Department spokesperson called me back rather than emailing me back.
Okay.
And said, as the matter is before the courts, we are unable to comment.
I just want to recap. 3 phone calls. 1, I'll say shy of abusive, but then recurring, getting a response back. The second one, really brushing you off, giving you nothing. And the third one saying, it's in front of the courts, so we again are saying nothing.
They say don't pick a fight with someone who buys their ink by the barrel.
Yep.
If this is the response that a newspaper, with the resources behind it, gets, what hope does an ordinary member of the public suffering grief and trauma have of getting any sense out of these organisations?
Sean, so you've got your responses, or lack thereof, or half-hearted, whatever we want to call them. Are you satisfied at this point with those?
Not at all.
Okay.
Look, the response from Michael O'Connell is, as you said yourself, about as good as you could ask for in terms of a public servant for an organisation that's under fire, giving an empathetic, compassionate response.
Absolutely.
There's not much more I could do with regard to the Families SA comment.
Okay.
That is a defence. The matter is before the courts, therefore we can't comment. You don't want to annoy, screw up, otherwise affect the trial process. The matter that I was least happy with, though, was the DPP. Because you remember Adam Kimber said, I'll investigate Mr. Egbert's concerns.
That's right.
Well, an investigation has an outcome. By their nature, must take a certain amount of time. They're finite.
Correct.
Investigations don't go on forever. I thought that a response should be forthcoming fairly quickly.
Was it?
I rang every single day
for
2 weeks. Just calling in.
Yep.
Is the investigation concluded? No, not yet. We'll make a statement when we're ready. Okay, great. Day 2. Calling again.
Right.
Is the investigation ready? I did this every day, as I said, for a fortnight, because I wanted to know, for my sake, for my readers' sake, and especially for Janet and Steve's sake, what was actually going to happen.
Do I dare ask, at the end of that 2 weeks?
I'm on a tram on Father's Day with my family, and I get a call from Adam Kimber. He says to me, why do you keep calling? And I say, because I want an answer. I want to know what the outcome of your investigation is going to be.
Yeah.
And he says to me, all right, can we speak off the record? I say, absolutely, of course we can. And so I have an off-the-record conversation with the DPP as the tram takes me from the city of Adelaide down to the bay. I'm not going to tell you what he said.
Because as we discussed,
it was off the record.
Correct.
And he activated it the correct way.
Absolutely.
But what did happen was I was able to write a follow-up article, having received an official on-the-record response from Mr. Kimber.
Okay.
He said that he will meet with Janet and Steve, face-to-face. And his spokesperson said, the director has advised that it is not his practice to put into the public domain communications with victims, nor is it his practice to communicate with victims through the media. No exception will be made in this instance.
Okay.
The director has invited Mr. Egberts and his partner to meet with him personally, and that invitation has been accepted.
I take it from that the DPP at this stage has not met with these people yet.
Him personally?
Yeah.
Probably not.
Okay.
Because, of course, the DPP oversees an entire department of
I mean
prosecutors.
the office of the DPP. Someone.
Well, the office would have, in the sense of meeting with them to talk about here's what's going to happen with the trial. Obviously, not to the level of detail we would hope, because we know they only just found out.
Yeah.
But someone in their office has been speaking with them.
Okay.
Possibly someone called a victim support officer.
Sure.
They have dedicated staff members whose job is to liaise as a
Okay.
go-between.
Cool.
Adam Kimber himself wouldn't have met the
Sure.
Egberts at all.
Mm-hmm.
So he's offering to meet with them personally to hear their concerns face to face.
Okay.
2 weeks after, Steve has said it all in black and white in the advertising.
Okay. Also, we don't do that through the media.
We don't do that through the media.
So, Sean, thank you for your assistance in this. Could you please butt out?
Very much so.
Is that kind of...
Oh, very, very
Okay.
much so.
Yeah.
So I thought the best thing to do was call Janet and Steve and find out what they thought of this.
Because that says there the invitation's been made and accepted.
And I am pleased to report that for a change, I was not the one giving Steve and Janet the news.
Excellent.
Finally.
That's excellent.
They had heard about something before I had.
Okay.
And Janet gave the response on behalf of herself and her husband. She said, "We're so grateful to the advertiser for facilitating this meeting. It wouldn't have come about without the article."
Even though, without exception, we do not make these connections through the media.
Makes you think, doesn't it?
No, it makes you frustrated and probably infuriated would be my term, Sean.
This is not supposed to be the job of the media,
Nope.
to facilitate communications between victims and prosecutors.
Yeah.
Yet without me doing that, literally,
It
this
doesn't
would not have
occur,
happened.
yeah.
It doesn't occur. So that's where we were. We still had several months to go before the planned January resumption of the trial.
Yep.
But at this point, everything goes back to radio silence again.
Okay.
Steve and Janet have their meeting
Sure.
with Adam Kimber.
Mm-hmm.
It's a private meeting. They don't tell me what happens. I don't ask.
Okay.
Mr. Kimber's certainly not going to tell me because he's not going to conduct things through the media.
We know that.
That's pretty much the end of it for a while.
Okay. So as you said, we've still got a number of months to go until, as we said, January.
January, when we all come back to the Supreme Court before Justice Blue again
Mm-hmm.
to find out what we're going to do. Just before that happens, though,
Yep.
a spontaneous little hearing is called, a pre-trial hearing,
Right.
at which time I'm allowed in.
Okay.
And the prosecution announces that this is going to be a battle of the experts.
Right.
Remember, their task is to disprove this notion of automatism.
Yep.
Defense doesn't have to prove it.
They can make the claim.
That they can make the claim. They have made the claim.
Correct.
They've got a psych report backing up their claim.
Sure.
Therefore, prosecution must now disprove it.
Okay.
So the prosecution says, we have experts lined up. We're ready to go.
Mm-hmm.
We also are going to call the ambulance officers, the police officers, and the hospital staff to whom Stephen Pete confessed. Remember those 6 bizarre confessions?
Absolutely. That sounds more than reasonable.
We're going to call all of them.
Yep.
They're going to come give their evidence. And then we've got the psychological evidence to put on, which we says prove beyond reasonable doubt that Stephen Pete was not an automaton at the time.
Sure.
Now, Your Honour, that's going to be very complicated evidence. It's going to be very in-depth evidence. Our suggestion is that we hold the trial, open court, publicly, with these witnesses, these ambulance officers, these police officers coming in, telling their stories. And then after that, rather than calling the psychologists to the stand, we will submit to you expert evidence reports.
Okay.
And you can then sit down, read the 2 sets of reports, and come to a conclusion. Because this is the thing, trial by judge alone. Justice Blue will determine whether or not Stephen Graham Pete was mentally incompetent at the time Amber and Corey were killed.
Right.
Keep in mind, there's no doubt Amber and Corey were killed.
Absolutely.
The very nature and manner of their deaths shows that that was no accident, there was no misfortune, that was a deliberate act.
Yep.
Pete is not necessarily denying that deliberate acts were caused. What he's saying is he wasn't in a mental state where he's responsible for what he did.
acts, yeah.
That's right. So that's what this all hinges on. So a couple of days before the trial is due to kick off, we're told what the lay of the land is going to be.
Okay.
And so we all walk into court on that morning in January,
Yep.
10 o'clock into the Supreme Court, ready to go. Defense barrister Bill Boko stands up and says, Your Honour, can I have a 2-hour adjournment?
So what?
Can I have a 2-hour adjournment?
Just the fact that you're asking for another adjournment after setting this in motion 6 months ago.
6 months and 2 hours.
Well, and that's my next point. And then it's just for 2 hours. So what's that about?
He says, There will need to be some discussions with my client owing to some recent developments. We'd ask the matter be held until midday so that we can speak with him. Now, I want to point something out here.
Yeah.
One of the biggest problems for a defence lawyer in South Australia is getting into a prison to see your client.
Yep.
It is extraordinarily difficult.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to book a time. That time's got to be kept.
Mm-hmm.
If the prison goes into lockdown, it's cancelled. The prison has the right to cancel those appointments for
Sure.
any reason. If there's too many lawyers trying to get in at the one time and you're at the back of the queue, you'll lose your
Yep.
opportunity. So if something happens last minute, as by the sounds of things at this point it has,
Okay.
there's every chance Mr. Boko's had absolutely no opportunity to speak to Pete
Okay.
yet.
So that might account for why he now needs that 2 hours before. Okay.
And importantly, Pete's physically in the Supreme Court building in the
Correct.
cells. He can't go anywhere else. Bill Boko and the defence team can actually go downstairs into the cells and sit with him and
Has
say,
access to him.
Stephen,
Sure.
this is the situation right now.
Sure.
So it's a frustrating request, but it's an understandable one. So in that 2 hour break, I actually finally get my chance to meet Steve and Janet face to face.
Okay. So this is, out of everything else, there's a moment here where you actually get to meet Steve and Janet. What was their reaction to you and you to them?
It was really lovely. It was a shake of the hand with Steve. It was a hug from Janet.
Sure.
They were very grateful for what went on
Yep.
in those earlier months. Personally and quietly, they told me the nature of their meeting with Adam Kimber.
Okay.
I'm not going to share that detail because that was just between us.
Sure.
And they said that, they were very anxious.
Yeah.
Very, very nervous.
As understandable.
Steve is, and I mean this as a compliment, a fire plug of a man. Well built, strong. He looked like a wind could have knocked him over.
Yeah, right.
Janet is one of the most empathetic, giving, and expressive people I've ever met. She doesn't wear her heart on her sleeve. She wears it revolving around her in an orbit.
Okay.
So generous with her love, so generous with her time. And she was trying to keep it together, but so scared. As she said to me, she was terrified about what they were going to hear next. She expected something else to go wrong. And who could blame her by that point?
Absolutely. With that in mind, you've finally met Steve and Janet. We've had a 2 hour adjournment after 6 months. We walk back in the courtroom. What happens next?
Bill Boko says, "Thank you for that time, Your Honour. Could I ask that my client be rearraigned on the 2 murder charges that are left, please?" To be rearraigned means to have the charges read to you once again to enter your pleas. My brain starts ticking. You don't ask for a rearrangement unless there's a change in circumstances. And there can only be one possible change in circumstances. So after all we've been through,
Yep.
after this 6-month and 2 hour adjournment, Stephen Pete gets asked for the second time if he murdered Amber. He lowered his head, sighed heavily, and answered, "Guilty." And before the court could react, he was asked if he had murdered Corey. He paused, swallowed hard, and answered, "Guilty."
And with yet another bombshell and a twist and a turn we didn't see coming, we'll pick back up with this in the next episode of Just Lawful. We just really quickly want to say thank you to all of our listeners, whether you're hearing the broadcast via 5AA or you tuned into our podcast on both iTunes and Spotify. We thank you very much. You can, of course, contact us via the Instagram and Facebook page at Just Lawful Podcast and at Just Lawful Pod on Twitter. Of course, you can also catch up with Sean and all of his work with the Advertiser and Adelaide's true crime scene at Sean Fuster at both Facebook and Twitter. And of course, as always, we just want to leave you with the words. Please enjoy our work, don't become our work, and we'll speak to you on the next episode of Just Lawful.